Hello again. I want to speak today about the idea of the multicultural society. This is essentially the only game in town when people are talking about immigration, Islam, or any other of those controversial topics which so many people steer clear of for fear of causing offence or drawing unfavourable attention to themselves. I need to give a very brief history lesson before discussing multiculturalism, so I hope that viewers will bear with me. Until about 1970, late 60s, early 70s, anybody talking about immigration in this country assumed automatically that the goal was integration. That is to say that immigrants to Britain, whether from India, Africa, or the Caribbean, would do their best to fit into the way of life which they found here. That is to say that they would adopt our ways and try to behave like us, follow our code of public conduct, and do their best to become British. There was a long tradition of this process in Britain. For instance, after the end of the Second World War, many thousands of Polish people who had fought on our side remained here when the communists took over Poland. I remember that wave of immigration. I was at school with pupils who had names like Marcelo Andruszkiewicz and Rachel Zelinsky. But here's the thing, their families were really grateful to be allowed to live here, and they did their best to fit in with our ways. They certainly were proud of being Polish, but they knew that if they were going to live in this country, they had to live like us, and so they did. So too, by and large, did the immigrants from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent who came here in the 1950s. Many of them became more British than the British themselves, something which was observed with Jewish immigrants in the early 20th century. Always, the unspoken rule was that these people should do their best to adopt our way of life and to behave like us. Then, in both Britain and the United States, left-wing academics and intellectuals started to question why newcomers should integrate. This was part of the iconoclasm of the 1960s, when everybody was questioning all the old certainties. So the question was, why should newcomers integrate? Was our way of life any better than that of people in India or Africa? Why should these people abandon their own customs, their own way of life, their own language, and adopt ours? Why should they not be encouraged to live in the same way that they had always done, even though they were now living in our country? In America, the integration model was at that time known as the melting pot, in keeping with the unofficial motto of the United States, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. From the late 1960s onwards, the idea of the melting pot was replaced by the salad bowl as the most desirable model for immigration. Instead of fitting in and becoming just like everybody else, those arriving in America as immigrants should be encouraged to retain their national and ethnic identity, to carry on with their traditional way of life, to speak their own language, and generally conduct themselves as they had done in their homeland. There's an unfortunate tendency for bad American habits to cross the Atlantic and take a hold here, of course. And so we in Britain slavishly followed America in this new and exciting pattern of how to behave towards immigrants. This then was the beginning of multiculturalism, and it meant throwing out all ideas of integration, which increasingly became seen as a form of neo-colonialism in which white people tried to get those of other nations and different ethnicities to follow their way of life rather than cherishing their own. It is this idea which now rules supreme in Britain. It is a brave person or a foolish one who dares to challenge the wisdom of multiculturalism these days. Of course, multiculturalism is all well and good if those immigrants whom you are welcoming into your country have a culture which emphasizes hard work, academic excellence, peaceful coexistence, and living in harmony with your neighbors. So, when Chinese people or Koreans landed in the United States, or Gujarati Hindus or Sikhs in our own country, this worked well enough. These people simply settled down quietly, worked hard, kept themselves to themselves, and became by and large ideal citizens. The difficulties emerged when people came here whose traditional way of life was so very different from our own that encouraging them to retain their traditions caused terrible problems for other people, namely those of us who are already living here. For example, some people came from countries with a tradition of settling disputes by stabbing or shooting folk with whom they disagreed. Others had a tradition of seizing women by force and compelling them to have sex, or of beating their wives and denying them freedom, of marrying their cousins or even their uncles or aunts. Traditions of smoking cannabis, shouting in the street, robbing people, or hating and exhibiting hostility towards those whose religion was not their own. We have all of us seen ample evidence that not all cultures or ways of life are equally desirable, and yet still we adhere to the flawed ideology of multiculturalism, insisting in defiance of all common sense that every way of life must be accorded equal respect, no matter how injurious it is to our society, and no matter how much harm it causes to the indigenous population of our country. Integration is still viewed by progressive people in Britain as a form of racism, trying to elevate the British way of life over and above that of other ethnicities and cultures. I do not imagine for a moment that multiculturalism is likely to collapse overnight, but I do believe that those of us who are still able to see the flaws of this weird idea should start drawing attention to them. I think that we should begin advocating for a return to the idea of integration, of being proud of our way of life and insisting that those who choose to come and live here follow our customs, our laws, and our way of doing things. Even if it does not effect any immediate change, I think we should be ready to point out how the multicultural experiment has failed and the harm which it has wrought here. Unless we are prepared to stand up and be counted, then we have no business complaining when the ill effects become ever worse year after year.